The poems we'll read for this week are primarily sad poems. They're what we might call pastoral or rural elegies, and they mourn the passing of a rural agrarian way of life and its replacement with a more mechanized, modernized society. Um, but the end of the farming culture in England can't really be solely blamed on the changing times. There's also a more direct and a legislative cause for this change to the countryside. These are actions that cause the farmers to dwindle in number, caused the landscape to become more ruined and more desolate across the 18th century. The legislation to which I'm referring are called the Parliamentary Acts of Enclosure, and we more often just call them by the shorthand Enclosure. This lecture provides you with a very short introduction to enclosure. Today, when you buy a house, you buy a plot of land with a house on it, or maybe you buy a plot of land and then you build a house on it. Either way, as a landowner, you become very aware of the borders of your property. You know who your neighbors are, and you know what kind of people they are, because they affect your property value and you, in turn, affect theirs. Your land is completely bordered, and your sense of your neighborhood, your town, your state, or even your country is that it's filled with landowners like yourself, lots of pretty little parcels of land. Our view of land is entirely influenced by enclosure, but we don't have, not in recent memory, a pre-enclosure version of property available for comparison. In a pre-enclosure era, there was just land, and it wasn't always owned. Maybe you owned a small piece of land, with or without neighbors, on which you built your little cottage and had a little garden. But that tiny garden wasn't going to keep you and your family fed and clothed. So you had a flock of sheep, whose wool you harvested and whose lambs you slaughtered to eat or sell. But where did your sheep graze? On the common land that nobody else owned. Here you can see how the common grazing land was plentiful in this unenclosed village, but there's an implicit inefficiency that is part of this system of agriculture. As land becomes more populated, how do you keep your herd fed when your neighbor is also competing for grazing rights to that same land? There's only a finite amount of grass to go around, so as the countryside becomes more populated, competition sets in. All of a sudden, that common grazing land has a value. And as it picks up the value, the government realizes. And what the government realizes is that they could make a lot of money if they just took that common land, declared it theirs, parceled it up, and sold it off. Enclosure was a long process. It spanned centuries, wars, monarchies, intellectual reformations, but it reached its height in the late 18th century. Nearly three-quarters of all parliamentary enclosure acts were issued in one of two waves of activity. The first, involving the conversion of 2 million acres of arable open fields, was between 1760 and 1780. The second wave of enclosure extended over an even larger number of acres and started in the early 1790s. Now, this probably sounds like it was a devastating change, and I'm sure it was for the shepherd who turned up the common green to graze his flock of sheep one day and found the entire thing fenced off. This would have forced him to go home, watch his sheep starve to death, and kill them off, hoping to capture one last bit of profit. But keep in mind that the bulk of the process of parliamentary land enclosure spanned half a century. Furthermore, what happened officially through these acts of enclosure had been happening unofficially for several centuries before this period, and in countries the world over. Because as populations grew, local governments, principalities, fiefdoms, they all had to make money. So what we have here in the last part of the 18th century is a set of dramatic poems that claim to be about the sudden and precipitous decline of rural life, even though this decline was clearly much slower and much more drawn out than the poems suggest. But enclosure makes for a really good backdrop for talking about the importance of the common man, the importance of feeling over reason, and the need for a compassionate, sympathetic nation to keep the government in check. Now, not only did enclosure change how people made money, it also changed how the countryside operated. One of the most dramatic changes to the countryside, and one that is repeatedly written about, is that The timeless quality of agrarian life gave way to the more modern dependence on the clock to measure time. The timelessness of agrarian life is in direct conflict with the modernized version of labor that counts productivity by punching in and punching out on the clock. The shepherd living in the idyllic countryside, grazing his sheep, he does not care if the year is 1760 or 1761, and in fact, he doesn't care if it's 1560 or 1360. What does he care about? He cares if it's September and if he has to stockpile enough wood to make it through the winter. He cares if it's May and his sheep are giving birth to the lambs. He cares if it's morning when he wakes up, if it's noon and too hot to work, then it's time to rest under a tree. And if it's dusk, then it's time to take his herd home. The agrarian way of life depends on the cycle of the seasons, not on the progress of historical time. You can probably see how nicely the rising importance of historical time fits in with the Age of Enlightenment, and how by rejecting that model of time in favor of seasonal time, Romantic writers both mourn the passing of the agrarian lifestyle while also hoping to preserve it. Time, therefore, becomes an unwitting battleground subject for the Romantics and helps them to illustrate death and loss. Here is a comparison of the open field system and the post-enclosure system. Open fields visually represented Old England, while the enclosure of fields was a reflection of the expanded nation and a new economy. Under the open field system, individuals were able to own property. With the sale of the common lands came the arrival of wealthy landowners who rented small strips of property to tenant farmers. Open fields offered unimpeded views of the countryside, while enclosed fields put up hedgerows and fences. Open fields relied on communal labor for sustainability. Closed fields turned the work of the laborer into an individuated role. Open field systems relied on barter systems, while under enclosure, wages grew common. The leisure of the open field system allowed for artisanship and craft work, while the post-enclosure landscape relied on machinery to maximize efficiency. Under the open field system, a variety of indigenous crops were farmed, whereas after enclosure, the large manor house farming system turned certain towns into places where only a few kinds of plants were cultivated. The village economy was self-sustainable under the open field system, whereas rural communities came to depend on urban markets after enclosure. Under the open field system, workers enjoyed a feeling of productive idleness, that their days were productive even when they were not actively laboring. In a post-enclosure economy, time is money. Before enclosure, the countryside is governed by the change of the seasons, and after enclosure, historical time ties the village to its urban center. If this concept of productive idleness sounds a little bit too familiar, there's a reason. It's because the life of a college student is not so different from the life of a shepherd. Every day, you're one step closer to graduation, and it doesn't matter if you've herded your sheep, or gone to class, or done your homework. So, on that note, enjoy your week and try not to be too productively idle. Bye.